I'm truly pleased to be here because I've never been even in South Carolina anywhere, and so it's an adventure and a great one so far. All the comforts one could imagine, and also the fact that this is a group of people who are not mostly directly part of the university, which is usually where I am. That also is refreshing and distinctive for me, and I'm very pleased to be invited to get off my track a little bit. Thanks for that. So yeah, this is anybody who talks or writes about toilets is of course being autobiographical, no matter how much they try to shield that fact. And of course, for most people who come to a lecture about toilets, it is out of their personal interest, at least in part, as opposed to their social conscience. And so here we are. Let's go way back. This is an actual excavation site in what is now Italy. This is what it was. And so some of these spaces held as many as 60 human beings simultaneously using the facility. There were not partitions between them. It isn't that the wood has rotted away or the stone has crumbled. These were social occasions. And it helps me introduce the notion that things can be different. We could put on our sort of anthropological imagination and imagine a different restroom, a different private toilet as well, and in fact not having private toilets hardly at all, as another way of doing it. As just a note, and some of you are involved in design, and I've done prior work in product design and industrial design, and I know there are likely architects in the room. Here we have a situation where everything is open, except the fact that people are wearing clothing that shields them, because that's the nature of the Roman garb. So you are not actually exposed. So in a way, you're taking your toilet stall with you. It's part of your costume. And saris, for example, have that same setup, and 19th century women's skirts had that setup. It's just another way to deal with a situation that this kind of illustrates. Here is a tourist, and so we've got a picture of the picture making. It's amazing to me that this is not such a well-attended site. What's going on when somebody talks about this bodily function? So it's very interesting to me because there's a lot of silence, and I'm going to be making that less silent. That's sort of one of my hobby horses, is to make that silence not silent. This is a silence of separation and concealment. So we all know that this is a necessity of life. And compared to the other end of the digestive system, the eating, this one is the silent one. And eating is the noisy one. And so our journalists, our books, our cookbooks, our designers, anything to do with the making of food, the consumption of food, is a project of discourse, an unending debate and discernment and connoisseurship. But when it comes to this phenomenon, then that's not the case. It's all about concealment, don't ask, don't tell, and separation. Separation of each from one another, and separation of each in terms of understanding what the other is doing and how they do it. For example, I have children and grandchildren, and I was a child, and no one, so I have a lot of experience in this realm, and no one really ever told me how to wipe my ass. So there's artists here. I thought I would try to bring down the level as much as I can, because when you walk through this museum, it goes all in the other direction as I was passing the gallery spaces. This is an artist, an Italian artist, although this site is in, I think it's Rotterdam. The seeing but not being seen. And so we have some concealment going on. This was an installation that was put up in Britain, in Rotterdam, and I can't remember a number of other places. And it's all mirrored on the exterior. But on the interior, it's one-way mirror. So in fact, there is a functioning toilet on the inside. So the person inside can see out, but the outside person cannot see in. And this has a mystique about it and a frisson about it, because the artist is playing with that concealment issue and compromising that concealment and just suggesting the possibility of not concealing. So I came here on an airplane, and always, not always, but often on airplanes, I'm aware of how it might be improved if when you were inside the facility, inside the bathroom, if there was a one-way mirror so that you could see outside while you're inside. And you could see if, some people who do applied work, so I'm getting very applied here, you could then see if somebody is waiting and whether you can take a few more moments and you won't inconvenience anybody. Now that kind of thing, we'll get to that kind of topic in a little bit. That kind of thing shows how once the thing can be brought out into the open, then there is improvement that is at least conceivable, whereas no one can raise it. If people will just laugh at Boeing if somebody raises it, or at United Airlines, then it's not going to happen. Because for something to happen, it first must be discursive. It must be speakable. And this is the function that dare not speak its name. This is in San Francisco and in the Exploratorium, which is a wonderful science museum, primarily for children. And what they've done is installed a toilet in the middle of the galleries, which is a water fountain. And again, you see, they're playing with that edge. They would only have something to do because there is an edge, because they are betraying a set of conventions. Now, the scene we know oh so well. We were speaking about travel beforehand, and the American way of life is distinctive when it comes to these facilities. I've been on architectural committees for university buildings, I think only university buildings, and worked with the major architects of the world. And what they do is, when it comes to designing the men's room or the women's room, after so much detailing on everything else, then it's like, okay, they give it to the lowest ranked person in the firm, who then does the restrooms, and it's not discussed. The tiling might be discussed, and the countertop, what kind of marble, but the stalls are just, they call up Home Depot, and the same crap is sent again and again and again. And that's because it is not to be discussed. It's only a joke if somebody brings it up. So here we have, so when things can't be discussed, they stay the same. And this has been the American standard way of doing it for at least 40 years. I tried to get to the origin, and there's an archaeological project for somebody to get into. This is the distinctive American system. Whoops, oh, there we go. Those of you, most all of us have traveled enough to know that putting space below so that people can look in, and space above so that people might want to look in, can look in. At the seams, they're all open. So we have a compromise. You see, public restrooms, this is a very, I think, important thing. People must have privacy. And it is a mark of civilization to provide people with privacy. But at the same time, we don't want them to just be able to do anything. And you can know a culture by how it settles that. How much risk do you take that they might do something you don't like, as opposed to how much do you betray the human decency of giving people a kind of secure privacy. And this is the American system, and it's one of the weirdest in the world, because I do travel, and the Italians don't live like this, and the British don't, the Germans don't. It's the way we settle this problem of concealment versus inspection. Phew, you know, I see this, we all do, but when I see it, I get perturbed. This is Auschwitz, and this shows what happens when you have no regard for the decency of another human being. These are people that at Auschwitz they did want to keep alive long enough to use a bathroom, which of course was not the majority, it was a minority of the population that went through Auschwitz, but this would have been the workers at Auschwitz, and they are treated as less than human. And there it is. That's the less than human. As opposed to, so that we don't just go nothing but downbeat, this is from Britain, and this was 19th century, late 19th century, public restroom in Britain, and they used the phrase with pride, splendid in their public ways. This was in London, and these are urinals, but if you can still see remnants of it in places like London, of marble enclosures and so forth. And this was part of something called the sanitation movement. This is not long after it is discovered that disease is caused by the admixture of feces and drinking supplies. The famous experiments of Lord Snow in London. And this led to just gangbusters in terms of public baths and establishment of sanitation facilities for the public. This is an example. This is, by the way, is the Taj Mahal. For those of you who don't get to the Taj Mahal, if you did get there and you were a man and went to a urinal, this is what you would face. And it's pretty cool. Also, just to keep going on an upbeat note, and because there are designers and architects in the room, this is just an example of how when you don't have just a sort of parenthetical interest in designing the public restroom, a public restroom can look like this. And we've all seen once in a while a terrific public restroom, even in the United States. And this is an example of such. One of the things that is always going on in the United States and most every place in the world is the distinction between men and women. And this is, as we know all too well, much fuss is made over that distinction. And nowhere is that distinction more fuss made than at the restroom, where it is a severe pollution to have men where women need to be and women where men need to be. And of course, that's led to all of these great anxieties and dilemmas now that we know there are transgender people and gay people and lesbian people in our midst. So here you see the designers are forever working out how to make the distinction. And they get quite playful with it. Usually it's just not playful, it's just a standard sign, women and men and women. But here's just an example of somebody who tried to be creative. Those are the separate doors, one to the women's room, one to the men's room. This is a very interesting sort of design feature of not only our culture, but most every. This is the words of a sociologist writing, a kind of, former student of mine, in fact, a kind of segregative punctuation. That's what happens when the men's room and women's room happen, when someone's got to go. So we all know this experience. I just had it a little while ago, just before we talked. I was talking with a group of men and women, and I said, excuse me. And so then I go into a segregated a gender segregated space. And of course, the history of gender segregation in the United States is one of lessening of it radically. I mean, teachers and professors and doctors and lawyers and all that, we just now presume that they'll all be gender integrative, but not when it comes to the public restroom. So this guy, Spencer Cahill, it's the restroom, a kind of segregative punctuation that serves to reaffirm differences between the sexes, despite almost continuous contact between them. And I think we largely take that for granted. And that creates certain problems, which we're going to talk about. Oh, here's other ways of marking it. This is a men's room entrance, and that's the women's room entrance. Other people send me these pictures. It's one of the great things of having my particular perversion is that I get sent these images. Oh, this is a great one, isn't it? You museum people will maybe think about doing something like this. The point is that who says it has to just be a sign on the door? And when you go to institutions, including museums, which are otherwise just filled with creativity, then you go to the restrooms, it's just a restroom. And it just says men and it just says women. And all their great stuff, they don't use it. I don't get it. This is a great problem that gender segregation enforces and lays on women, because women are, despite the progress that's been made, more likely to be taking care of small children, and they've got to figure out what to do with them. And the restroom, the public restroom rarely provides any provision, which is why this is a humorous but sincere effort. I mean, this is an actual product, a way to deal with it. But it could be, there could be mechanisms, including staff, that would help. Again, it's just a shock. And those of us who've had small children know that it just becomes a big problem. And which bathroom to use and at what age. And this, again, is now in our newscasts. But at what point does a little boy become a male and need that room? What point is a little girl? When is a little boy a boy, and when is a little girl a girl? And just so, and no more issues. And here's another problem. I think they used this on the image for the publicity for this event. But it does happen that a man is taking care of a woman. Of course, it's more commonly the other way around. A woman is taking care of a man. But the point is that it's mixed, but the facilities are not. In some parts of the world, this is an urgent matter. It's often urgent in this country, but it's a routinely greater urgency. So in India, it's still the case that almost half the population still defecates in the open. And so access to a restroom it's a big deal. And people line up for it. The line at the women's facility, as we've all experienced, those of us who are witnesses or those of us who are women, know that the line at the women's room is much greater. And so it is here. And in India, a great problem is access in safety, because when women have to go, especially if they're at night, they risk exposure to danger. Women have high levels of illness, of ailments, and infections, which are caused by holding it in. And there are interviews that Indian sociologists have done of how people cope. And they cope by limiting their eating and drinking to certain times of day and quantities to certain times of day and night in order to have regular, to achieve regularity in when they will have access. And I think we all know, even in this country, that we regulate ourselves when we leave work, when we take breaks, where we go. That is, do we use the restroom where we're going to sit on a toilet and our feet will be seen by our colleagues, or do we go somewhere else? I've surveyed my students. They often go somewhere else. because they don't want to be connected. And especially given our restroom design, which doesn't shield noise at all. So these become things to be avoided. And so it's reflected in behavior, including routines of work that people work out, or they go home early, and thus the work doesn't get done. All this is silent. You see, that's what is important. Okay, now we can talk about solutions and what does that look like. So one of the, no, I'm still talking about problems. This is going to ooze into some solution, I promise. So what you can see, I wonder if this is, yes. This is an auditorium. It happens to be in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. Yeah, by the way, because of security issues now, you can't find on the web floor plans anymore of public facilities. Anyway, but this is an old one, and there it was. And what you can see is it's a typical auditorium. The stage is here, and the restrooms are here. I'm going to give you a detail of that in a minute. And I'll go back to that image. But what you can see is there's the stage, there's the seating, and we've got the women's room, and we've got the men's room. And this auditorium and theater space is laid out as is quite conventional, just almost exactly like this again and again around the world. And to keep it symmetrical, which it is, you have the men's room and the women's room are mirror reflections of one another, and they're the same size. That's the point I'm getting at. But they need to be different size. And I love this example because for me it's also about affirmative action, which is the only way that you can give men and women equal opportunity in terms of being able to get back to their seat after intermission is by giving women more. But if you segregate, that's the first decision that creates the problem, and maybe that's the way it's got to be, and we're not radical enough to mix the genders. I am, but maybe we're not. So if you're not, okay, this is the way that's solved, and it's solved in a way that disadvantages women systematically, and we've all seen that. And some jurisdictions now have what are called potty parity laws, in which the women's room has to be bigger than the men's room. And I've had discussions, and my students also discuss with each other and create great anger among one another, because some of the, I don't think they do it anymore, but the young fellows would say, well, the women take too long. And the take too long, of course, is the men don't know that women menstruate, for example, which adds time, that women's clothing takes more time, that women wear jewelry takes time, women have longer hair, takes time. Now, how much of that you acknowledge? Women maybe talk more, and maybe they're more intimate with each other than men are. Maybe that's good. You can get off that track wherever you want and think that women need to be compensated for their distinctive bodies, distinctive clothing, distinctive folkways. That's a political matter. Like all political matters, there's going to be disagreement. But this has an architectural reflection and has an architectural solution at whatever level you think it should be. Professor Higgins, do you remember him from My Fair Lady? And he asked this really great question. Why can't a woman be more like a man? And then we wouldn't have all these problems that I've just described, or we would have many fewer of them, because men are fast. They need boom, boom, boom. There we go. And so a creative person has tried to work out an answer to that. And this is a female urinal in which the woman can manipulate that receptacle to suit her own biology, and we problem solved, I guess. This is another version of making a woman more like a man, and mimicking the male way of doing things. This is Communal, the Urinal. It comes in small. I assume that means it comes in medium and large, although I haven't seen the examples of that. But there's another way. This is not a unique thing, but it's just still another aspect. When you design the stalls in that standard way that you saw before, it means that if there's an additional facility, like an element that, for example, is for sanitary napkins or Tampax, or for people who use drugs, well, no, including people who self-administer for medical reasons, or they are addicts. Either way, they need more space if you're going to honor those needs, which is an open question. Do women matter? How much? And how much square feet do we give them? Taxi drivers. New York has a much smaller number of taxi drivers per capita, per taxi driver than, say, Chicago or San Francisco. And one reason, I think, is because there's no place to go, because you can't park the car. The cabbie, they can't park the cab very easily. This is a cab stand which has been set aside so the cab driver can then run in a deli, and of course there's got to be a deli, where they will let the cab driver in. And there you go. Back to gender. This is an actual urinal, and done by this sculptor, Clark Sorensen, based in San Francisco. He has a whole line. It comes in orchids and pansies and roses and all kinds of things. And the reason why I'm just so interested in it, here I'll show you another image, is how delicate it is. First of all, you need a very civil society because people have to respect the delicacy of the public facility, which in the United States is often a problem. In Japan, for example, it's not. So they can design public, when they used to have public phones, they can design them and presume that no one's going to disturb them, whereas ours had to be like bank vaults and built very strong like that to withstand. But here, my main point is that this is a gender bender. It's a male facility, and it's made into a flower. Pardon me?
Like pollination.
Like pollination, right. Wouldn't that be a lovely thing if it was kinetic? Here's another playful move. So ordinarily, because you can't be playful about these things, it's a land of secrets and tension and concealments and all business and no laughter, please. So whatever the designs are, they tend to stop at the restroom door, no matter what the rest of the place looks like. We get serious here, except a little bit of a gesture in the other direction. In Stockholm, they've done this artistic scenery. There are other places I've seen where they do that, including video art inside the restroom. And then here's having some fun. Isn't this one good? This was in New Zealand. I think it's the Sofitel in New Zealand. And this is in Korea, and it's a restaurant. And the motif is toilets and sinks, the bathroom. And again, it just to expand our cross-cultural knowledge of the varieties of ways in which these things can be done and can be handled. Another issue that arises, some of you may remember Senator Craig. Senator Craig of Utah, who was a leader of the homophobic right in the American Congress. And it was, this does happen. Senator Craig was picked up in the Minneapolis airport trying to arrange sex with someone at the adjoining stall. By the way, one of the other design elements of the American standard stalls is that gay men, when they did that sort of thing, could signal each other underneath, whereas if the stall wall had gone all the way down, then this fearful activity would have been frustrated. But it's because of the anxiety that it made possible this kind of choreography, in which case here a United States senator was picked up, and he was arrested, and it ruined his career, and so forth and so on as the scenario happens. But it's because part of the whole regime of design is grounded in these anxieties. That's the other piece of this that then backfires on occasion. The other solution for these anxieties is to just shut them down completely. And that's really the American story, which we have closed our restrooms massively. Virtually every significant New York subway station had a men's room and a women's room. You can still sometimes see the tile that says men and women on it. Now they're magazine stands, or they're just places for them to put tools and equipment. You see the statistic on what the British did within 10 years. That's the motto, pretty much. Starbucks is our public toilet. And I felt very badly for Starbucks. I don't feel that badly for Starbucks. I have other things to worry about. But that when the trouble happened in Washington, D.C., I assume that made the news. Everybody knows about that? Yes. Yes. Two black men were in Starbucks to meet a business partner, and while they were waiting, one of them asked to use the men's room. And instead of giving them the code or whatever, the police were called, and the men were arrested. And they were there completely on the up and up. But the point is that we depend on the kindness of strangers, since we don't have public restrooms as a matter of course. When we do have public restrooms, this is again in Britain, they can be very harsh. And again, because we've got to keep them out of sight as much as we can, get them on the downplay and not give them really good privileged spaces that would be, for example, financially valuable. And so here we see that it's a very dystopian environment in public space that the public restroom gets. They have them, but that's what it's like. And this is an example of what the British did. Because they were worried, not the British, in this instance, they were worried again about what people will do in the privacy of their stalls, and they were worried about intravenous drug users. And so what they did is put in this ultraviolet lighting, which makes it very difficult to see your own veins. Which means, so it's a way to discourage the use of the men's room for that purpose. One of the things it leads to is blood, and people not knowing if their needles are clean, because, and I've been in restrooms like this, it's horrible. I mean, the lighting, if you have any aesthetic inkling whatsoever, I mean, it is just horrible. And so people, in effect, do to everybody these terrible things because you don't want some people to do those terrible things. So everybody is punished, which is a story again and again. As opposed to needle exchange. This is just an image of a volunteer who set up needle exchange out of the trunk of his car, and he goes around to homeless shelters and places like that. The public restroom is a natural place for needle exchange. So one way of dealing with it is to put that lighting up. The other is to tear it down, close it up. And the other is, here's our clientele. And product designers would by instinct, would go, here's our clientele. We're going to set up needle exchange here. What a great solution. But that's not at all, of course, what is done. Our restrooms also determine what kind of religions and cultures we adhere to. So in the West, we move our bowels by sitting rather than standing or squatting. And so our toilets are designed that way, and we wipe ourselves with paper as opposed to water. And in many parts of the world, especially Islamic parts of the world, they've coded it as to which hand you should use for which function, which is another way of dealing with it, or helping to deal with it, or you have water. This is in Abu Dhabi. I called it ecumenical because you can do either one. There's toilet paper, which you can see, and there's a water hose, which you can see. Here's a wonderful thing. This is, are there any product designers here? Yeah, great. No tricky questions. No questions. Oh.
They actually can safely put their beverage, their phone, their keys, their pocketbook, a hook on the back of the door is pointless if you're a woman, since we're all friends and talk about bathrooms. If I have to go in and change a tampon, first it's 3 feet away, 2 feet above my head. I have to waddle over and hope I don't bleed on the inside of my leg.
Ooh.
My clothes, to get my tampon out there. And those are I'm sorry, but that's the reality for women. Women's bathroom experience, the reason it takes us so long is we have to use both hands. We have to squat. We oftentimes, I'm wearing a dress, I don't have pockets. How many men, when you go to work, do you ever not have a pocket to put your cell phone or your keys in? I will say probably never. For women, we're like all excited. Oh my God, we got pockets in our dress. And so the bottom line is the women experience in a bathroom is markedly different. We do have pockets. The design is our pockets range anywhere from 60% to 48% smaller. If we even have them, very often in the back, we don't really even have pockets. They're so shut. The bottom line is, I don't know if I'm really a product designer. I'm actually an attorney and a prosecutor, but I'm on February 10th of 2018 with an $8 beer at a Jason Isbell concert and had nowhere to put it. And I couldn't hold it in my mouth because it was full. And so I was like, I can't put it on the ground. Nobody could hold it because I'm a woman. I can come to things by myself. And I had used sanitary napkin receptacle, curved toilet paper dispenser. I put it on the dispenser. You know what happened? It fell and it crashed. And I spilled out from bandit.
Wow.
And I got to get back in line. I'm going to miss the concert that I spent
No.
a bunch of money to go to.
No.
And
Okay.
so the bottom line is, I was tired of it. I'm tired of adjusting and adapting, and I designed this.
Yeah.
And I want it in every bathroom and in
No. I don't.
I didn't know we were going that far, but
We heard you roar. That's great. So, that's what we need more of in this world. That's what we need. And here's my little tinkle into that zone. Right. This is a product that is on the market. The one I know about was made in Spain, and maybe now they're made and in Japan. The Japanese really, of course, are leaders in all of this. But this is a toilet and sink combination. And what this means, if it's used in a public facility, which it sometimes is, it means that when you are done with your business, then you can, and pardon the euphemism even though you've broken the code, it means that when you're done cleaning yourself up, your hands won't touch anything that anyone else will touch before you've washed them. Because when you flush the toilet, it sends the water up out of that faucet, out of the toilet tank. That's right there. You wash your hands, the water goes back into that tank and goes away as old water. So the water is recycled on site at least once. That's what it does, and it means your hands are clean and ready for then the next thing you touch to be touched with clean hands. So it's really so, to me, smart, and yet it can't catch on because it can't be discussed. very easily. It also uses less space than conventional designs and uses less materials. I'm not going to talk about that, but that is urine and has a story behind it, but I don't want to, I'm very worried about, I'm so worried about urine. Okay, so I'm going to head, well, just spend a second for this. So this is another way round of, in this case, helping people with disabilities, is rather than marking it as a place for disabled people, you mark it for what it has. In New York, the public theater, which is where Rent and Hamilton was first produced, they're very advanced and all that. And so their facilities just list what's inside. So it just says on the wall, urinals, toilets, sinks, and the other one doesn't say urinals. And so toilet with wall grip rather than disabled people. One of my colleagues and I took an effort at trying to sketch a public restroom that would solve some of the problems that I talked about. And one of the elements that's not visible there, but which in another variant, is we need to be able to make the boundaries fluid. So it's very common in classroom design, that in hotels, convention hotels, that the rooms can rise and fall, can grow and truncate. But the ratio of men's space to women's space is fixed, which then throws everything out of kilter because some kinds of events draw many more women, and it's known in advance. If it's about crochet, then convention, it's going to be more women. If it's about boxing, it's going to be more men. And so you can then adjust it. The other thing you can do is try to design it in such a way that when men are using the urinals, as happens here, they're not in fact, obvious about it. And there can be screens, for example. There are all manner. And some of the architectural firms I've worked with, they're eager to do it. I mean, they love stuff like this. But the administrators and the vice presidents of engineering, they're scared of it, and then they haul them in, and and it becomes conventional once again. So yeah, so I did do this book. This is a book with numbers of contributors, and we just call it Toilet. We don't just call it Toilet. It's called Toilet, Public Restrooms, and the Politics of Sharing. And so that's essentially what, I'm a sociologist, and that's where it comes down to, which is what are we willing to talk about, think about, share about ourselves, our bodies, and how much space and resource will we give to people who are different than we are. So, whoops, that was in China, and that's another picture that people have sent me. So thank you very much, and I'm available. Where's my boss? Can we take questions? Yeah? Yes?
I read recently that there was a well-funded effort to provide women in rural India with flush toilets, but the women didn't want to use them. They thought, if she's sitting in that seat, that's dirty. Preferred to go in the field where it was clean. And so it went nowhere.
Right. So the problem is a more generic problem, which is that you can install these facilities in cultures which are not used to having them, and they in fact go unused. They also can be vandalized. The parts can be sold for scrap, where they're more valuable. So all sorts of issues come up. So the conventional wisdom is that you can't just plop them in, that you need, in effect, anthropological orientation toward the setting in which you're going to be, and you need to approach it that way, rather than boom. Yes, sir. And then we'll go to you next.
American van
especially with a suitcase. A stall door that goes inward and you can't get around it. Is that a particularly American thing? That's a new one for me. Does anybody know?
It's not.
Well, the problem with it is that you've got to back up against the toilet in your nice trousers and touch, strap up people's urine or something in order to get the door open far enough to get out. Which brings me to my question. I'm a very fastidious person and I have a lot of issues around all this stuff. Are we the only culture where there are a lot of very fastidious people? I mean, is it really true this stuff won't hurt us if we touch it? I mean,
Well, I'm not I'm probably less fastidious than you. But a urine is cool. I mean, you don't have to fear urine. So let me just lift that from your the curse that our mommies laid on us. Urine's fine. Feces, not so good. You got to watch it. It is virtually universal that people do not want to be around their own feces or other people's feces.
urine is fine when it's fresh.
Right.
But seriously, it's full of nutrients and things start to feed on very quickly.
No.
It's the ammonia odor and so forth.
It's even almond milk that'll happen. No, you really have to. But this gets us to the issue of disease, and including from feces and the toilet seat anxiety, which came up with the case from India, but which also here in this country people have great fear of toilet seats. By the way, women, and I get this from my students who are great informants, that they hover. The women students hover over the toilet seat rather than let their body touch it. And of course, that will work until people are not great hoverers. And then there's urine on that seat. Was one, yeah. And so it becomes then, the more it goes on, the more filthy the environment becomes.
I just
Oh, I owe you, okay. Yes. No, go.
It's true that most European places have better stalls than the U.S. now, but I have a lot of memories from back in the day of experiences in, I guess let's say, bars in France and Germany where there was no toilet at all, but just like a hole in the floor.
You just stood there.
You just stood there or squatted there. I mean, you couldn't put it down even if you wanted to. And so I think that the cultural comparison is a little bit, I don't know, time-based?
Yeah. So I think we need to make America great. And, and that means having holes and no seats because,
Conserve water.
well, somebody just said conserve water, but I was thinking of proctologically. The best way to go is to squat. And I had another former student who wrote a wonderful book called The Chair. She's a professor of architecture at Berkeley. And do you know that book?
I read about it in the Times.
Okay, so she has a very bad back, and so she's unable to sit. And so she was motivated to write this book called The Chair, and it's damn the chair. That's the point of the book, because the chair causes us to lose our musculature to be able to squat. And the squat is a much more healthy way of defecating. So we think of, this is so interesting from a product design standpoint, we think of the chair as serving our body, but it's the reverse. Our body has been stolen by the chair. And when you join a gym, which I have done, and they ask you your goals, and they want to hear things like, well, I want my abs to be X, Y, or Z, or whatever. And no, I want to be able to squat. They don't, that's not on the list. No. You know, when you walk past the gym and they have the reasons why you should join, it doesn't say, you'll be able to squat. No. And you know, when we were young, I used to be in Mexico, and you know, people would just squat. And it's convenient.
Like watching the Korean grocers snap the peas.
And snap the peas, right. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, you bet it does. And the United States is certainly not a leader in welfare legislation, but when it comes to disabilities, it is. We have very powerful disabilities organizations, and it's in the codes, the architectural codes, the planning codes. Yeah, it's strong. And that has a consequence. Because, so for example, in efforts to create something like the old pissoir, but for toilets as well, on the street. And San Francisco, Portland is the most advanced, as I understand it, in the United States, is having these facilities out sort of in the sidewalks. They have to be able to accept ADA, they have to be ADA compliant, which means they have to be large. And then if they're large, they're expensive, much more so than the pissoir of you know, the 20th century. So it's very consequential. Yes. No, no. Yeah, there's more than one thing going on. I mean, I'll give you another example of a norm in the United States, which came out of a kind of progressive instinct, which was the war on pay toilets. And so it was considered illegitimate in the United States for people to be charged to go to the bathroom. And that came, I think, from a humanistic perspective. And in Europe, they didn't have nearly so much a humanistic perspective. And so that meant that the Europeans could continue on with being able to self-finance these facilities in a way the United States can't, which becomes another reason to close them down. Yes? Oh, I'll get you next, I swear.
You did touch on incarcerated individuals. Here in the United States, of course, the cells are open and everything is public. Is there a difference in Europe in how those individuals are treated with their bathroom needs?
So the question was, is there a difference in Europe for incarcerated people? Do they have more privacy, for example? And say other decencies in using the toilets. So I'm not an expert at all, except I know that Europe is quite internally differentiated, just in terms of the degree of punitiveness with which they deal with their prisoners. So in Scandinavia, in virtually every way, recreation access, visitation, educational opportunities, and yes, the restrooms, it's more open. But I don't know the degree to which Hungary, who knows? I don't know. Yes, yeah.
I find it very fascinating how sometimes the cultural criteria in one country change when they're transplanted into a different country. For example, here in places like Starbucks or McDonald's, it goes without saying that you can use the bathroom whenever you want, obviously for free. It would not cross your mind to have to pay for it. When these companies go into, let's say, Russia, they come in with the same concept and then very quickly have to adapt because, as you mentioned, a lot of public restrooms that, used to be free, then you had to pay for them, and then they just disappeared, so there's nowhere to go. So, but you know that, if you see a McDonald's, that's a place to go, or if you see a Starbucks or a couple other places. So over the last couple of years, they had to change it so they give you on your receipt a particular PIN code. They changes every single time that you have to type in, or they come up with other ways. And I think it's really fascinating because having lived here, you're just used to it. So when you come to Starbucks and you have to find out a particular device to do it, it's very interesting to experience that.
Right, and I think one of the other things that's going on is that over history, these changes, is the degree of being a stranger. So in France, for example, the neighborhood you live in comes with certain bars where you have a right, in effect, to use that facility. And there are other, in Britain, the pub, and anybody can use that pub because it's just an implanted custom. So we don't have that. And by the way, this idea of you can go anywhere, I always use myself as an example with my students of a completely privileged white man. I can go anywhere, and I'm old, and nobody gives a shit, and I can just do what I want. And until I went into one of the Midtown hotels to use the men's room. And the guy came up to me. I said, my students told me this, I'm incredibly stupid to do this, that I walked up to a person in the hotel and I said, excuse me, where's your restroom? And they said, are you staying in the hotel? And I said no. And they said, well, it's only for our guests. I said, I'm meeting a guest. And they said, what is the guest's name? And so I was had. I mean, that's the kind of, yeah, but that, at my age and, you know, having once owned a Volvo, did me like, yeah, did me no good. And I thought I was in the clear. Yeah, so, and homeless people, of course, and people of color face that in a quite routine way. And also people in various states of transgender. And I know some people, and they, you know what they do? If you want to use a women's room, you keep jewelry underneath, and then you pull it out so that it's conspicuous, so that helps you get access to the women's room in an unproblematic way. Yes?
Is there an acceptable ratio in public restrooms, I guess in America, where it's like 2-to-1 for women to men? Because so many times they are about the same size, but has there been studies done where there's a ratio?
Yes, there are studies, and it's led to legislation in different parts of the world and within the United States in different states and jurisdictions. So I mentioned the Potty Parity law. It's in effect in California, in New York. I don't know about South Carolina, for example, but it's become quite standard now. The problem is the retrofits, which is that you have this entire built environment that is built the other way, and also the changing ratio depending on who's there and for what purpose. And that becomes a kind of incorrigible problem. Yes, sir?
They've solved the problem in Maine. We were there this past summer.
In Maine, did you say?
Yes.
Solve the problem in Maine.
Restaurants have one bathroom, and it's unisex. So you have to wait in line. Doesn't matter if you're a guy or a gal.
So, but it's just one stall.
One stall.
Wow, that's not a great solution. I mean, that's the airplane.
But they've just leveled the playing field, and that's just...
Well, again, it's a way to level the playing field. Everybody is screwed. I mean, that's an unhappy denouement. Yes, sir.
There's a small New Zealand town where the public restroom is the #1 tourist draw.
Yeah.
It's been successful enough that other towns in that region are considering imitating it. Are there other instances where the public restroom is a public asset, a tourist draw?
Yeah, so I know of a few. Some of you may know California. There's a place called the Madonna Inn. And when you go up to urinate, it's a waterfall over rocks that then come down, and your body trips it off. And all the women come into the men's room, and the men go into the women's rooms because they have their other features. And so that's one example. Also clubs. So say I'm past the clubbing era, but clubs press that boundary, and they, giggling, visiting, and that's me. My bathroom call, yes.
The Burning Man Festival has something interesting that is different about this. You have 70,000 people all using porta potties, and there are a number of theme camps there that have pee funnels for women. And the whole thing is passing out pee funnels so the women can use the porta potties but use the urinal side, not the toilet side, because the toilets are dirty. And it's just this predominant thing with several theme camps at Burning Man
Great. Is there,
I think we might
Oh.
wrap it up now. If you want to speak individually for a few minutes afterwards, I want to say, I understand a lot of you guys came tonight because you found the topic so interesting. That says two things to me. First of all, Design League was worth it for you guys to come, and it was worth it for us to bring you. So, you know.
that's saying a lot.
So, thank you guys so much for being here. Well, Harvey will be here for a few more minutes if you want to speak with him individually, but
Right.
let's
Or,
get up and enjoy. Thank you guys so much.